They called her the plain sister, the spare, the daughter you throw away to a blind, scarred king because she is too invisible to matter. Her family thought she would just fade into the shadows of his frozen castle. They thought a man without his sight wouldn't care what they gave him. They were wrong. Because while the rest of the world looked right past her, the blind Alpha King saw exactly who she was, and he was about to make them regret ever letting her go. The carriage creaked to a halt at the edge of the gray stone courtyard, and Claire Whitmore pressed her palm flat against the folded letter in her lap. Her father's words were still sharp in her ears, spoken the morning she left. "You are only useful if he marries you." She had not answered him then. She did not answer him now. She lifted the curtain and looked out at Thornwood Keep. It rose against the pale autumn sky like a clenched fist, all dark towers and narrow windows, its walls streaked with the damp of 100 winters. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke and wet leaves, and somewhere beyond the gate a dog barked once and fell silent. There was no fanfare waiting for her, no line of servants, no cluster of curious faces, just the heavy iron gate and the silence of a place that had not asked for her to come. The carriage door opened, and a young woman in a plain wool dress dipped into a quick curtsy. Her face was round and friendly, and her eyes swept over Claire with open curiosity. "You must be Lady Claire. I'm Marin, the head housekeeper's girl. His Majesty asked me to see you to your rooms." She paused, then added in a lower voice, "He's in the great hall. If you want to greet him first. He said you could, if you wished." Claire gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the uneven cobbles. The cold bit through her thin traveling cloak, and she pulled it tighter. "I should greet him," she said, more to herself than to Marin. "It would be discourteous not to." Marin nodded and led her through the great oak doors. The hall inside was vast and shadowed, lit only by the fire in the central hearth and a few guttering torches along the walls. The stone floor was worn smooth by generations of boots. At the far end, before the high table, a man stood with his bogrovir, think to the fire, his hands resting on the carved back of a chair. He was tall, taller than she had expected, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark brown hair that fell just past his jaw. He wore a deep gray tunic and a leather jerkin, and his hands bore the pale lines of old scars. His eyes were open, fixed somewhere in the middle distance, and Claire understood at once that he was not looking at her. He could not look at her. The firelight caught the gray blue of his irises, and there was something unnerving in how still he stood, how perfectly composed, as if he had heard her footsteps the moment she crossed the threshold. "Lady Claire of House Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying no warmth. "You have traveled far. You must be weary." She curtsied, though she knew he could not see it. "I am well, Your Majesty. The roads were kind." "They rarely are this time of year." He turned his head slightly, and for a moment it seemed he was listening to something beyond her, the crackle of the fire, the shuffle of Marin's feet, the distant murmur of servants in the corridors. "Your father's letter said you were eager to come." Claire hesitated. The letter in her pocket had said nothing of the sort. It had said, in her father's cramped hand, that she was to marry the blind Alpha King and give Whitmore a foothold in the north, and that she was not to fail. She swallowed the truth and said, "I came as I was bid, Your Majesty." A long pause. Then Alexander inclined his head, a gesture that was neither approval nor dismissal. "Then you are welcome to Thornwood, such as it is. Marin will show you to your rooms. We dine at dusk, if you care to join me." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of protocol, spoken as if he had rehearsed it 100 times for 100 different brides. Claire murmured her thanks and followed Marin out of the hall, her cheeks burning with a quiet shame she could not name. The rooms they gave her were in the east tower, far from the bustle of the keep. They were clean and spare, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the practice yard. A fire had been lit in the small hearth, and someone had laid a sprig of dried lavender on the pillow. It was the only personal touch in the room, and Claire did not know whether it was kindness or merely habit. Marin lingered by the door, her hands twisting in her apron. "If you need anything, my lady, just ring the bell, and if you don't mind my saying so," she bit her lip, then went on in a rush. "His Majesty is not unkind. He just keeps himself apart. Ever since the battle, he doesn't trust easy. But he's fair. Fairer than most men, even with eyes. Claire looked at her, surprised by the sudden earnestness. The battle? Marin glanced over her shoulder, then stepped closer and lowered her voice. 3 years passed, in the Thornwood Pass. They say his own man turned on him in the night, led the enemy straight to his tent. He took a wound to the face that cost him his sight. After that, he sent almost everyone away, keeps only those he's known since childhood. She shook her head. Ah, but I talk too much. Forgive me, my lady, you must be tired. Claire thanked her, and Marin slipped out, closing the door with a soft click. Alone now, Claire sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her father's letter from her pocket once more. She did not need to read it again. She knew every line by heart. The first paragraphs were about trade routes and alliances. The last line was the one that had followed her all the way from the south. Remember that you are only useful as long as he keeps you. Find his weaknesses and write to me. Your sisters were too good to waste on a blind man. You are not. She folded the letter slowly and tucked it into the pocket of her traveling cloak, where it lay against her like a cold stone. Outside the window, the light was fading, and the practice yard below was emptying as the last of the soldiers headed indoors. A few of them glanced up at her tower, then away, as if she were not worth a second look. She had expected this. She had been expected to be overlooked her whole life. The plain middle daughter, the one who was neither beautiful nor clever enough to draw attention. Her mother had said it often enough. Claire, you blend into the walls. Her sisters had laughed. Her father had never once argued. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched the last light drain from the sky. Somewhere in the keep, she could hear the low murmur of voices, the clink of cups being set for dinner. She did not want to go down. She wanted to stay here in this small, quiet room where no one could see her and decide she was not enough. But she had come this far, and turning back was not a road that existed. She rose, smoothed her dress, and made her way down the winding stone stairs toward the great hall, where the blind Alpha King was waiting for a bride he had not asked for and did not want. And as she walked, she whispered to herself, the words she always used to steady her trembling heart. Perhaps it will be gentler than I fear. Perhaps I can be useful here. Perhaps... She paused at the foot of the stairs, her breath catching. Perhaps that will be enough. But the words hung in the air like a question that had no answer. And in the flickering torchlight of the corridor, Claire Whitmore, think very small, and very alone, and very far from home. The great hall of Thornwood was a cavern of stone and shadow, its long tables lit by candles that barely reached the vaulted ceiling. Claire sat at the far end of the high table, a place of honor that felt more like a cage, and across from her, at a distance of several empty chairs, Alexander of House Thornwood ate his meal in silence. He did not fumble for his cup or hesitate before his plate. His hands moved with a quiet precision that spoke of years of practice, and his head was tilted just slightly, as if he were listening to something beyond the crackle of the hearth. Claire watched him, fascinated despite herself. She had expected a man diminished by his blindness. Instead, she found herself seated across from a king who seemed to see more with his ears than most men did with their eyes. "You are staring," he said without looking up. Claire's cheeks burned. I am sorry. I did not mean to." "Most people do not mean to. They do it anyway." He set down his knife and turned his face toward her, and though his eyes were fixed somewhere past her shoulder, the weight of his attention was undeniable. "Does my appearance disappoint you, Lady Claire? I am told I look different from the portraits they paint of kings." "No," she said quickly, and then, because honesty had always been her failing, she added, "You look like someone who's carried a great deal." He went very still. The silence stretched, thin and taut, until one of the servants stepped forward to refill his cup. Alexander waved them away with a curt gesture and rose from his seat. "I trust you have everything you need for the night. The servants will see to your comfort. I take my leave." He did not wait for her reply. His steps were sure, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the flagstones, and Claire watched him go with a strange ache in her chest. She had been dismissed, the way one dismissed an appointment that had overstayed its welcome. And yet, in the small space between his question and her answer, something had flickered, something she could not name. She did not sleep well. The bed was soft, and the linens smelled of lavender, but her mind would not quiet. She lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, and thought of her father's letter, tucked beneath the mattress where no one would find it. "You must be useful, Claire. That is all you have ever been good for. Do not fail me in this." Useful. The word followed her into her restless dreams and woke her before dawn, her heart pounding with a nameless dread. She rose, dressed in the same plain gown she had worn the day before, and slipped out of her room before the castle stirred. The garden was a tangle of late autumn roses and overgrown hedges, wild in a way that the rest of the keep was not. Claire wandered along the gravel path, breathing in the cold, sweet air, and found a stone bench half hidden behind a sprawling rosebush. She sat down, hugged her knees to her chest, and let out a long breath. It was the first moment of peace she had known since she left home. And because she was alone, or thought she was, she began to hum. It was an old tune, one she had carried with her since childhood, though she had never known its name. Her mother had hummed it before the fever took her, and Claire had kept it the way other girls kept their mother's jewels, hidden, treasured, hers alone. She hummed it softly, the melody curling through the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. The roses nodded their heavy heads. A bird answered from the hedge, and then, "Time her," a voice spoke. "That song." Claire's heart leapt into her throat. She spun around, and there he stood, Alexander, his cane in his hand, his head tilted toward her with an expression she could not read. He was not wearing the formal coat of the night before. His shirt was open at the collar, his hair still mussed from sleep, and he looked, for the first time, less like a king and more like a man. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, though his voice was tight. "That song, where did you learn it?" Claire scrabbled to her feet, her cheeks hot. I do not know. I have always known it. My mother used to hum it when I was small." "Your mother?" He repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them. "Do you know what the words are? The words to the song?" "No, I never learned them, only the melody." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her skirts. "Why do you ask, my lord? Is something wrong with it?" He did not answer. He stood very still, his face turned toward her, and for a long moment Claire had the strange feeling that he was looking at her, truly looking, in a way that had nothing to do with his eyes. Then he took a step back, and his expression shuddered like a window closing against a storm. "It is nothing," he said. "A memory. I had forgotten it existed." He turned to go, but Claire, driven by something braver than her usual self, called out after him. "My lord, wait, please." He stopped. "Was it your mother's song?" she asked softly. "Is that why it matters to you?" The silence that followed was so heavy Claire thought she might drown in it. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, Alexander said, "Yes, it was hers." He did not turn around. He walked away, his cane tapping against the gravel, and Claire stood alone in the garden, her heart pounding, her mind racing with questions she did not know how to ask. Later that morning, Marin found her in the still room, where Claire had wandered in search of chamomile for her nerves. The maid took one look at her face and clicked her tongue. "You look like you have seen a ghost, my lady. What happened?" "I spoke with the Alpha King this morning," Claire said carefully, "in the garden. I was humming, and he asked where I learned the song." Marin's hands, which had been reaching for a jar of dried lavender, paused. "You hummed that song? The one about the roses and the river? I do not know what it is about. I never learned the words." "Ah." Marin set the jar down and turned to face Claire, her expression odd, somewhere between pity and wonder. "That song was the Alpha King's mother's favorite. She used to sing it to him every night before he slept, when he was a little boy. After she died, he never allowed anyone to sing it in the keep again. Not once, in all these years." Claire's throat tightened. "He told me it was a memory." "Aye, and you brought it back to him, whether you meant to or not." Marin shook her head slowly. He has not spoken of his mother to anyone since I have known him, and I have known him since we were children. You must have caught him off guard, my lady. That is the only reason he would have said such a thing." Claire stared at the jars of dried herbs, her mind churning. She had not meant to touch something so private. She had only been humming, the way she always hung when she was nervous, and now she had stumbled into a grief that was not hers to hold. "I should apologize," she said. "I did not know the song belonged to his memories. I should not have—" "Nonsense," Marin waved a hand. "You did nothing wrong. A song is a song. It is meant to be sung. And if you ask me, the Alpha King could use a little more music in this cold old keep." She picked up the jar of lavender and pressed it into Claire's hands. "Here, brew yourself a cup of tea. You look like you need it." Claire smiled weakly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She took the lavender and walked back to her room, her steps heavy with the weight of what she had uncovered. Alexander of House Thornwood, the man who ruled a kingdom with iron authority, had a wound so deep that the sound of a lullaby could still lead through it, and she, who had come here as nothing more than a discarded piece in her father's game, had touched that wound without meaning to. She sat on the edge of her bed, the lavender clutched in her hands, and thought of the way his voice had softened when he said, yes, it was hers. She thought of the way he had stood so still in the garden, as if the melody had reached into him and pulled something loose. She did not know why, but she felt the beginning of something, a thread, thin as spider silk, stretching between her and the blind Alpha King. It was not trust. It was not friendship. It was something smaller and more fragile, a moment of shared memory, unasked for and unreturned. And Claire, who had spent her whole life being invisible, found that she did not want to let go of it. The morning after the garden, Claire woke before the first light touched the window. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Thornwood Castle, the distant clank of a blacksmith, the low murmur of servants beginning their day, the creak of wooden shutters being thrown open somewhere below. She thought of Alexander. She thought of the way his voice had cracked around the word hers. She thought of the way he had turned and walked a tree, as if staying one more breath would have undone him entirely. She sat up, pushed the blanket aside, and made a decision she did not fully understand. By the time Marin arrived with a tray of bread and warm milk, Claire was already dressed, her hair in its usual loose braid, a small cloth bag tucked into her apron pocket. "Up already?" Marin set the tray down with a clatter. "The whole castle's still rubbing sleep from its eyes, and you're standing there like you've got somewhere to be." "I was thinking about the garden," Claire said carefully. "The lavender. Is there more of it? Somewhere?" Marin blinked. "Lavender. There's a whole patch by the south wall past the kitchens, but it's a bit wild. Nobody tends it much." She tilted her head. "Why do you ask?" Claire picked up a piece of bread, tore off a small piece, and chewed slowly to buy herself time. "I thought it might make the hall smell nicer," she said. It was not entirely a lie. Marin shrugged, clearly not convinced but too sleepy to press. "Suit yourself. Just mind the thorns near the old rose bushes." Claire waited until the castle settled into its mid-morning rhythm before she slipped out. The south wall was quiet, shaded by a row of old oaks, and the lavender grew in a tangled, fragrant clump that had clearly been left to its own devices for years. She knelt in the damp grass and began to pick, filling her cloth bag with sprigs and soft purple flowers. She worked slowly, humming under her breath, not the lullaby, never that again, but a simple tune her mother used to hum while mending clothes. The smell of the lavender rose around her, calming and familiar. She was not entirely sure what she was doing. She only knew that the image of Alexander standing so still in the garden, his face turned toward a silent no, she could not see, had stayed with her all night. She knew what it was like to carry a wound no one else could see. She knew what it was like to have a song lodged in your chest that you could not sing aloud. She did not know if the tea would help, but she knew she had to try. Back in her room, she borrowed a small pot from the kitchens. Marin raised an eyebrow but said nothing, and set about brewing the tea the way her mother had taught her. Lavender, a pinch of dried chamomile, a sliver of honey. She let it steep until the water turned pale gold, then poured it into a plain clay cup and set it on a small tray. She carried the tray through the corridors, her heart beating faster with every step. The east tower was quieter than the rest of the castle. the stone walls thicker, the light dimmer. She passed a guard who nodded at her without interest, and a servant who barely glanced up from scrubbing the floor. No one stopped her. No one asked what she was doing. She reached the door of Alexander's study and paused. The wood was dark, carved with the Thornwood sigil, a bare tree with roots spread wide. She could hear nothing from inside. She set the tray down on the small table beside the door, the cup still warm, and turned to leave. Then she stopped. She looked at the cup. She looked at the door. She reached out, knocked twice softly, and fled before she could hear a response. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the door open behind her. She did not turn. She kept walking, her heart pounding, her hands cold. She heard a pause, then a voice, low and measured. "Who left this?" She did not answer. She turned the corner and disappeared into the shadows, pressing herself against the cold stone, holding her breath. She heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. He was think toward the corner. Then, a second voice. Marin from somewhere farther down the hall, her tone bright and surprised. "Oh, Your Majesty, is something the matter?" The footsteps stopped. There was a long silence. "Nothing," Alexander said at last. "Tell me, who was just here?" "I didn't see anyone, Your Majesty. Shall I—" "No, leave it." More silence. Then the sound of the study door closing, soft and final. Claire did not move for a long time. She stood in the shadows, her back against the stone, her breath shallow, and waited until the corridor was completely silent before she slipped back to her room. Marin found her there an hour later, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. "All right," Marin said, closing the door behind her. "Spill." "Spill what?" "The tea." Marin crossed her arms. "I saw you with that pot from the kitchens, and I heard him asking about it." She lowered her voice. "The whole castle's talking. The Alpha King never asks about anything." Claire's cheeks flushed. I heard he doesn't sleep well. I thought it might help, that's all." Marin stared at her for a long moment. Then her face softened into something almost tender. "You made him tea, because you heard he doesn't sleep." It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Marin sat down beside her on the bed. "He asked who left it. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, just holding the cup. I've never seen him do that." She shook her head. "You know what he's like. He doesn't take things from anyone." Claire looked down at her hands. "He didn't know it was me." "He will." Marin's voice was gentle. "He always finds out." That evening, Claire could not eat. She pushed her food around her plate, her mind circling back to the study door, to the sound of his footsteps stopping in the corridor, to the low question that hung in the air. Who left this? She did not know why it mattered so much. She did not know why her chest ached at the thought of him drinking the tea alone in his study, with no one to tell him it was made with lavender from the south wall and honey from the castle's own hives. When the castle had gone quiet for the night, she slipped out of her room again. She told herself she was only going to check that the tray had been cleared. She told herself she would not linger. She reached the corner of the corridor and stopped. The tray was gone, but on the small table beside the study door where she had placed the cup, there was a folded piece of parchment. She picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was bold and angular, the ink slightly smudged as if written in haste, 3 words. It was good. She read them 3 times, 4 times. She pressed the parchment to her chest, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling bloomed there, something between warmth and a sob. She folded the parchment carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket, and turned to go back to her room. A voice came from the other side of the study door, low and clear through the wood. "Tomorrow. Leave it there again." Claire froze. Her heart stopped, then raced. She did not answer. She could not. But she heard, beneath the words, something she had never expected to hear from the blind Alpha King of Thornwood. A question. And Claire, who had spent her whole life believing she had nothing to offer, felt the first faint, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. The next morning, Claire rose before the servants had stirred the hearth. She had slept badly, not from fear, but from the strange, buzzing warmth that had kept her awake long into the night. She dressed quickly, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and slipped down the corridor with a small linen pouch tucked inside her apron. The lavender she had gathered the day before lay crushed and fragrant against her palm. She did not let herself think. Thinking would have stopped her. At the study door she knelt, set down the small clay cup she had brought from the kitchen, and poured the warm, honey-sweet tea into it. The steam rose in a thin spiral, catching the gray morning light. She hesitated for only a moment, then rose and hurried away, her footsteps soft as falling leaves. She made it to the end of the corridor before she heard the door open behind her. She froze, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. She did not turn. She could not. The silence stretched. Then a voice, low and rough with sleep, came through the morning air. "You are early." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hand to her mouth and did not answer. She heard him take a step into the corridor, then stop. "The tea is warm," he said, as if to himself. "You must have carried it from the kitchens. That is—" He paused, and she heard the faintest note of something like surprise in his voice. "That is kind of you." She did not wait to hear more. She turned and fled, her heart hammering, her cheeks burning. She did not stop until she reached the safety of her own room, where she pressed her back against the door and slid down to the floor, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He had spoken to her. He had spoken to her, and he had not known it was her, but he had said she was kind. She sat there for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, and felt something fragile and precious take root in her chest, something she was afraid to name. Later that morning, Menner found her in the garden, kneeling among the withered rose bushes. The older woman settled onto the stone bench beside her with a sigh and began to knit, though her needles clicked more out of habit than purpose. "So," Marin said without looking up, "you did it again." Claire's hands stilled among the dry leaves. "I don't know what you mean." Marin's needles continued their steady click. The study door opened at dawn. His Majesty asked the kitchen maids who were in the east corridor. They said no one. She glanced at Claire, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "But I know better." Claire said nothing. She could feel the heat rising to her cheeks again. "He asked about the tea," Marin went on, her voice light. "Who made it? Who carried it? He asked 4 times, I heard. Cook said she did not know. He was not satisfied with that answer." Claire's heart gave a strange, nervous lurch. He asked? "Oh, yes." Marin's needles paused. "His Majesty does not ask about things that do not matter to him. He asks, and he finds out. It is only a matter of time, my dear, before he finds out about you." Claire looked down at her hands, still smudged with earth and dried lavender. She did not know whether the thought filled her with fear or with something else entirely. That afternoon, a messenger arrived from the south. He was a thin, pale man with a pinched face, and he delivered a sealed letter into Claire's hands with the cold efficiency of someone who did not care to linger. She recognized the seal at once, the Whitmore crest, a hawk, wings spread, talons bared. She excused herself and retreated to her room before she broke the seal. The parchment was stiff and smelled faintly of the road. The handwriting was her father's, sharp and impatient. Claire, went. "You have been at Thornwood for a week. I trust you have made yourself useful. The king is blind. Use that. Learn what you can of his defenses, his alliances, his weaknesses. Report back to me by the next full moon. This is your only value to this family. Do not disappoint me." The words blurred before her eyes. She read them twice, then a third time, each pass leaving her colder. She had known, of course, you had known why she had been sent, but to see it written in her father's hand, so plainly, so carelessly, it was like a knife slipped between her ribs. She folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She would burn it later. She could not bear to look at it again. But she did not burn it. She could not bring herself to. It was the only thing her father had ever written to her, and even knowing what it asked, she could not destroy it. She hid it instead, beneath a loose floorboard beneath her bed, and told herself she would decide what to do in the morning. She was on her knees beside the bed, pressing the board back into place, when the door opened. She had forgotten to lock it. Sir Aldrich stood in the doorway, his hand still on the latch, his sharp eyes fixed on her. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a soldier's bearing, and he looked at her the way one might look at a suspicious footprint in the mud. "My lady," he said, his voice flat. "I knocked. You did not answer." Claire scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She tried to smooth her apron, but her hands were trembling, and she knew he had seen it. The movement, the hiding, the guilt written plain across her face. I am sorry. I did not hear you." "No," he said slowly. "I imagine you did not." His gaze swept the room, the rumpled bed, the floorboard, the faint outline of soap, the vague crest beneath it. "I came to inform you that the evening meal is served in the great hall. His Majesty prefers punctuality." "Thank you. I will be down shortly." He did not move. His eyes held hers, and there was something in them that made her stomach clench. Not anger, not accusation, but a cold, careful watchfulness. "My lady," he said, "I have served His Majesty for 11 years. I have seen many people come to Thornwood with many purposes." He paused. "I hope, for your sake, that your purpose here is what you say it is." He turned and left before she could respond. Claire stood alone in the silent room, her hands pressed against her apron pocket, where the letter lay hidden. She could feel the outline of it through the fabric, a small, sharp square of guilt. She did not go down to dinner. She sat on the edge of her bed as the light faded, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. She thought about her father's words, she thought about Sir Aldrich's eyes, and she thought about Alexander, standing in the corridor that morning, saying that she was kind. She did not know what to do. She only knew that she could not do what her father asked, not now, not after the tea, and the letter, and the way Alexander had said the word kind, as if it had been a long time since anyone had been kind to him. She was still sitting there, her hands folded in her lap, when a soft knock came at her door. She did not move. Her heart was too heavy for politeness. The knock came again, then a voice, not Marin's, not Sir Aldrich's. It was a servant's voice, young and uncertain. "My lady? His Majesty asked me to bring you something." Claire rose, her legs stiff, and opened the door. The servant was a boy, no more than 14, with a red face and a small wooden box clutched in his hands. He thrust it at her, mumbled, "From His Majesty, my lady," and fled before she could ask a single question. She closed the door and sat down on the bed, the box in her lap. It was a plain box, unadorned, but the wood was smooth and well-oiled, as if it had been handled many times. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a square of soft cloth, was her mother's comb, the one with the broken teeth, the one she had left on the garden bench 3 days ago, thinking it lost forever. The teeth had been repaired, not replaced, repaired. The broken ones had been carefully smoothed and reshaped, fitted back into the bone handle with a patience and precision that spoke of hours of work. The comb was not new. It was not perfect, but it was whole again, and it was hers. She lifted it out with trembling fingers and turned it over in her hands. The wood was warm against her palm. She thought as of Nander's hands, broad, scarred, capable of wielding a sword and holding a kingdom. She thought of him sitting alone in his study, running his fingers over the broken teeth of a stranger's comb, working to mend what she had thought beyond repair. A sob rose in her throat. She pressed the comb to her chest and held it there, rocking slightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She did not know how he had known. She did not know why he had done it. But for the first time since she had arrived at Thornwood, she felt the faint, fragile warmth of being seen. Not as a bride, not as a pawn, not as a Whitmore, but as Claire. She fell asleep that night with the comb in her hand, its repaired teeth pressing gently against her palm, and she dreamed of a garden where the roses were not withered, and someone was kneeling beside her, patient and warm, teaching her to mend a broken thing. In the parlour outside her door, Sir Aldrich stood in the shadows, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the faint light beneath her door. She hid something, he murmured to himself. What was she hiding? He did not move for a long time, and in his study across the courtyard, Alexander sat with his fingers resting on the rim of an empty clay cup, and he smiled a small, private smile. Tomorrow, he thought, she will come again. The fourth morning came with a pale gold light over the Thornwood walls, and Claire found herself walking the familiar corridor before the servants had even stirred. She carried the clay cup wrapped in a linen cloth, the steam rising in thin curls that vanished into the cool air. Her heart beat a little faster than it should have, and she told herself it was only the cold. She set the cup down on the corner of his desk, exactly where she had placed it the 3 mornings before. The study smelled of old paper and leather and something faintly like cedar. She lingered a moment longer than she meant to, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk, and then she turned to leave. "Still there," came his voice from the doorway. She froze. Alexander stood there leaning against the frame, his arms crossed. He was not wearing his usual dark leather coat, only a plain linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his unseeing eyes were turned toward her with an accuracy that made her breath catch. She started. "You did not run this time," he said. There was no mockery in his voice, only a quiet observation, like a man noting the weather. "That is progress." "I was not running," she said, and then heard how thin the lie sounded. He stepped into the room, his movements unhurried and sure. He did not use a cane, did not reach for the wall, and Claire found herself watching the way he navigated the space, as if he had memorized every inch of it, which, she realized, he probably had. He stopped beside the desk and picked up the cup, bringing it to his face. He inhaled deeply. "Chamomile, a little mint and something else," he said. "Honey? No, a touch of honey. And something warm like ginger but softer." "Rosehip," she said quietly. "Just a little." He nodded, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost like pleasure. "You know your herbs." "My grandmother kept a garden," Claire said. Then, because the silence felt too heavy, she added, "She used to say that a cup of tea could mend what words could not." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. His fingers turned the cup slowly, as if he were reading something in its clay surface. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Claire said. The words came out smaller than she intended, and she looked down at her own hands, at the calluses on her fingers from years of tending gardens and mending things that other people had thrown away. "Will you stay for a moment?" he asked. "The tea is better when it is not drunk alone." She should have said no. She had duties, or at least the pretense of them, and Marin would be looking for her soon. But something in his voice, in the careful way he held the cup, made her hesitate. And then she said, "Yes, I will stay." They sat in the study with the morning light falling across the floor between them. He drank his tea slowly, and she found herself talking more than she meant to. About her grandmother's garden, about the way the roses and Thornwood had come late this year because of the early frost. About the small brown bird that had built a nest in the eaves outside her window. He listened. That was the strange part. He listened like her words mattered, like he was storing them away somewhere careful. "You miss your grandmother," he said when she fell silent. "Yes," Claire said. "She was the only one who ever told me I was enough." The words slipped out before she could catch them, and she felt her cheeks go warm. She looked at her hands again, wishing she could take them back. But Alexander did not laugh at her. He did not look away in embarrassment. He simply set down his cup and said, very quietly, "Then she was a woman of rare good sense." Claire looked up, and for a moment she thought she saw something behind his unseeing eyes, a warmth, a recognition, a question. But then a knock came at the door, and Sir Aldrich's voice broke through the stillness. "Your Majesty, there is a matter at the eastern gate that requires your attention." Alexander's expression shifted, the warmth retreating behind a familiar mask of authority. He rose, and Claire rose with him, suddenly aware of how close they had been sitting, how much had been said in so few words. "I will see you at supper," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, "you will." She left the study with her heart beating against her ribs, and she did not look back. But she heard him say, just before the door closed behind her, "Thank you for the tea, Claire." He had said her name. He had said it like it meant something. The trouble came at midday, in the great hall. Claire had been helping Marin fold linens in the corner near the kitchens when a group of visiting nobles arrived, men from the southern border, where the land met the Whitmore holdings. They had come to negotiate grain prices, or so the steward had said. But as soon as Claire saw the man at the front of the group, her stomach tightened. Lord Percival of the other marshlands. She knew him from her father's court. He had always looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture, useful, perhaps, if the room needed filling. "Ah, and here she is," Percival said, his voice carrying across the hall. "The little Whitmore sparrow, come to nest in the blind king's castle. Tell me, girl, has he even touched you yet, or does he keep you for decoration?" The hall went quiet. Claire felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her chin up, her hands steady on the linen she was folding. She had learned long ago that showing hurt only invited more of it. "Lord Percival," she said, her voice even, "the Thornwood kitchens have prepared refreshments in the Eastern Solar. I am sure you will find them." "I asked you a question, girl," Percival cut in, stepping closer. His breath smelled of wine, even though it was barely past noon. "I hear they sent you because none of the other sisters would have you. Is that true? Did they pick the eckidest one and hope the blind king would not notice?" A few of the southern nobles laughed. Claire felt her throat tighten, but she did not look away. She had endured worse from her own father. She could endure this. Then a voice came from the doorway, low and calm, and the laughter died instantly. "I would choose her again." Alexander stood there in his dark coat, his head turned toward Percival with that unnerving precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The weight of his presence filled the hall like a storm gathering in silence. "Your Majesty," Percival said, his tone shifting to something oily and deferential. "I meant no offense. I was merely—" "You were merely speaking of my wife as if she were livestock at market," Alexander said, taking a step into the hall. "I am curious, thirst Percival. Do you speak of the Queen of Veldrith that way? Do you speak of your own mother that way?" Percival's face went pale. "Of course not. I only meant—" "You meant to insult her because you thought I could not see her," Alexander said, "and because you thought she had no one to defend her. You were wrong on both counts." He crossed the hall slowly, his steps unhurried, and Claire watched the southern nobles step back as he passed, making room for him without being asked. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the cedar and leather of his coat, and he said, "I may not see with my eyes, Lord Percival, but I see more clearly than you ever will." Percival's mouth opened and closed. For a long, awkward moment, he looked like a fish gasping on dry ground. Then Alexander turned to Claire, and his voice softened. "Just for her. Come," he said quietly. "You do not need to be here." She took his arm. She did not think about it. Her hand simply found his forearm and held on, and he led her out of the hall, through the corridor and into the quiet of the inner courtyard, where the rose bushes grew, their blooms late but stubbornly alive. They stood there in silence for a long moment. Claire's heart was pounding, and her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "You did not have to do that," she said finally, her voice rough. "Yes," Alexander said simply. "I did." She looked up at him, at the sharp line of his jaw, at the way the afternoon light caught the gray in his hair, at the unseeing eyes that somehow saw everything, and she heard herself ask, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you are worth more than they have ever told you. I have known you for 4 days, and I already know this. It is not your face that makes you beautiful, Claire. It is the way you mend broken things, the way you remember what people need before they know it themselves. The way you hum old songs in the garden as if no one is listening. That is not plainness. That is a kind of grace that most people spend their whole lives never noticing." Claire's breath caught. She felt the tears spill over, hot against her cheeks, and she could not stop them. She stood there, crying in front of a man she had been sent to marry, and for once, she did not try to hide it. "You see me," she whispered. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. And then, very gently, he reached out and found her hand, his fingers closing around hers. "I see you, Claire, and you are not plain. You are not a spare. You are not a pawn. You are the woman who brings me tea in the morning because she noticed I do not sleep well. You are the woman who hums a song my mother used to sing. You are the woman who mends broken combs and broken hearts without being asked." She could not speak. She could only stand there, holding his hand, feeling the rough calluses of his palm against hers, and let herself be seen. After a long moment he said, "Will you walk with me to the eastern garden? There is a spot where the roses bloom later than anywhere else. I would like to share it with you." "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I would like that very much." They walked together through the courtyard, his hand still holding hers, and Claire felt something shift inside her. Something old and heavy, something she had carried since childhood, beginning to loosen its grip. She was not a pawn. She was not a spare. She was Claire. And for the first time in her life, someone had seen her clearly. Not for what she could give, not for what she was worth on paper, but for who she actually was, and it felt, she thought, like coming home. Lord Whitmore arrived at Thornwood on the 7th day of Claire's stay. With 20 mounted men and a banner that snapped angrily in the autumn wind, Claire saw him from the window of her chamber, and her stomach turned to stone. She had not expected him. She had not even known he was coming. The letter she had hidden in the lining of her trunk had said only that she must report on the weaknesses of Thornwood before the next full moon. It had not said that her father would come to collect the answer in person. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone of the windowsill and tried to breathe. Marin appeared beside her, a half-finished piece of knitting dangling from her fingers. "Your father is here, my lady," Marin said quietly. "He has asked to see you in the great hall." "Did he ask to see the king as well?" "He asked for both of you." Marin hesitated. "He brought Lord Percival with him. The one who—" She stopped, biting her lip. "The one who called me a plain little thing in front of the whole courtyard," Claire finished. "Yes, I remember." She turned from the window and smoothed the front of her dress. It was the best she had, a deep blue wool that she had mended twice at the collar. It was not fine enough for a formal audience with her father, but she had nothing finer, and she would not borrow from the household to appear richer than she was. When she entered the great hall, Alexander was already there, seated at the head of the long oak table. His face was unreadable, his gray-blue eyes fixed on some point beyond the windows. Beside him stood Sir Aldrich, stiff-backed and watchful. Lord Whitmore occupied the chair across from the king, and Lord Percival hovered near the hearth, warming his hands why, king an expression of barely concealed amusement. "Claire," her father's voice cut across the hall like a blade. "Come here. Let me look at you." She walked forward and stopped a respectful distance from the table. "Father, I did not know you were coming." "Clearly." Lord Whitmore's eyes swept over her, taking in her plain dress, her unadorned hair, her quiet posture. He did not smile. "You look well enough. The northern air agrees with you." "I am well, father." "Good. Then you will not mind a small task." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach. "I have come to speak with the king about the terms of your union. There are matters of land and levy to be settled, and I would like you to tell the king, in your own words, how you have found the household here." Claire felt the trap close around her before she understood its shape. Her father was not asking her to praise Thornwood. He was asking her to speak, to say something that could be used, twisted, reported back later as disloyalty or as a confession of weakness. She looked at Alexander. His face had not changed. He sat perfectly still, waiting, his hands resting flat on the arms of his chair. "I have found the household kind," she said carefully. "The people are hard-working, and the land is well tended. I have no complaints." "Complaints?" Her father laughed, a short, humorless sound. "No, I would not expect you to have complaints. You were never one to make trouble, even when trouble was warranted. It is your greatest virtue and your greatest failing." He rose from his chair and walked around the table, coming to stand too close to her. Claire forced herself not to step back. "You are quiet, Claire. You have always been quiet. It made you easy to overlook, and I confess I overlooked you for Mom. Stayed 9 years, but now you have a purpose, and I would like to know that you understand it." He lowered his voice, but not so low that the others could not hear. "You were sent here to secure an alliance, to be a bridge between our houses. And yet I hear that you have spent your days wandering gardens and brewing tea. That is not what I sent you here to do." Claire's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of the hidden letter pressing against her memory. The words she had not yet spoken to anyone. She had refused to obey it. She had chosen Alexander. But standing here now, under her father's cold gaze, that choice felt fragile and foolish. "I have done my duty as I understood it, Father." "Your duty," Lord Whitmore repeated slowly, "is to serve your family, not to keep the King of Thornwood comfortable with warm drinks and soft words, unless," he turned to Alexander with a thin smile, "unless the king has found other uses for her. Has he, Your Grace?" The silence straxed. Claire felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not look at Alexander. She was afraid of what she would see, or worse, afraid that she would see nothing at all. Alexander did not move. His voice, when it came, was calm and level. "Your daughter has been a guest in my household for 7 days. In that time, she has conducted herself with dignity and grace. I have no complaints." "Complaints are not what I asked about," Lord Whitmore pressed. "I asked whether she has been useful, whether she has earned her keep." "Her keep is not in question." "It is, Your Grace. Everything is in question when an alliance is at stake." Lord Whitmore's voice hardened. "Let me be plain. My daughter was not my first choice for this match. She was not my second or my third. She was the one I could spare. I sent her because I thought she would be easy to manage, easy to please, and easy to forget. But if she cannot serve your interests, then she cannot serve mine either. And I will have to consider whether this alliance is worth pursuing at all." Claire felt the words land like blows. She had known this. She had always known it. But hearing it spoken aloud, in front of Alexander, in front of Sir Aldrich and Lord Percival, it stripped away the fragile hope she had been building since the garden. She looked at her father, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You have said enough, Father. I understand what I am to you." "Do you?" Lord Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Then prove it. Tell me what you have learned about this household. Tell me where their weaknesses lie, and I will know that you are still my daughter." The words hung in the air like a drawn sword. Claire understood now. This was not a visit. This was a test. And the test was whether she would betray Alexander to prove her loyalty to her father. She turned to Alexander. She did not know what she hoped to see. Some sign, some gesture, some word that would tell her he was on her side. But his face was still unreadable, his gray-blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond her. And he said nothing. "Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you wish me to answer?" The silence stretched. Sir Aldrich shifted uncomfortably. Lord Percival smiled into the fire. And still, Alexander said nothing. Claire felt something crack inside her chest, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, quiet crack like ice giving way under a boot. "I have nothing to report," she said at last. "I have found no weaknesses because I have not looked for them. I came here as a bride, not a spy, and I will not become one now." Lord Whitmore's face went cold. "You ungrateful, enough." Alexander's voice cut through the hall, not loud, but final. He did not rise from his chair. He did not even turn his head, but something in the quality of his stillness made every person in the room fall silent. Lord Whitmore turned to face him. "Your Grace, I am disciplining my own daughter. That is not within your jurisdiction." "Your daughter is my wife," Alexander said quietly. "That places her within my jurisdiction. And I will not have her spoken to in that manner in my hall. She has refused to serve her family. She has refused to serve you. What use is she to either of us?" Alexander was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost tired. "That is a question you have answered for yourself many times, my lord. I do not think you will like my answer." Lord Whitmore stared at him, his jaw tight. Then he turned to Claire and his eyes were cold as winter stone. "You have made your choice, daughter. I hope, for your sake, that you do not come to regret it." He swept toward the door, Lord Percival trailing after him. "I will remain at the border until morning. If you change your mind, if you remember what you owe your family, you know where to find me." The heavy doors boomed shut behind them. The great hall fell silent. Claire stood alone in the center of the room, her hands trembling at her sides. She had done what she believed was right. She had refused to betray Alexander. But the cost of that refusal sat heavy on her chest. The knowledge that her father had publicly named her worthless, and that Alexander had not once, contradicted him. She turned slowly toward the king. He had not moved. His face was still unreadable, his hands still resting on the arms of his chair. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice cracked. "Did I do the right thing?" Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked toward the window. "I did not know your father was coming," he said at last. "I did not know he would speak to you in that way. That is not what I asked." Her voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. "I asked if I did the right thing. If you—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "If you believe I am still worth keeping. Here, as your wife." The silence that followed was unbearable. Claire watched his back, the broad set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested on the window frame, as if he were bracing himself against something. She waited for him to speak, to offer some reassurance, some word of comfort. But he said nothing. After what felt like an eternity, Claire took a step back, then another. "I see," she whispered. "I will leave you to your thoughts, your Grace." She turned and walked out of the hall before he could say anything, if he had anything to say at all. She did not look back. She could not. The corridors blurred around her as she made her way to her chamber. Marin was waiting at the door, her knitting forgotten in her lap, and she rose with a look of concern as Claire entered. "My lady, please, Marin. Not now." Claire closed the door behind her and leaned against it, pressing her forehead to the cool wood. Her father's words echoed in her ears, sharp and relentless. "You were the one I could spare. You were easy to forget." She had thought, for one brief, beautiful moment, that Alexander might be different, that he had seen her clearly and chosen her anyway. But tonight, in that hall, he had not defended her. He had not contradicted her father. He had no thanks at a single word to tell her she was worth anything at all. Perhaps, she thought bitterly, the blind king of Thornwood was just as good at not seeing her as everyone else. She slid down the door and sat on the cold stone floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. She did not cry. She was too tired for tears, too hollow for grief. She simply sat there in the dark, waiting for something, she did not know what. A knock, a word, a sign that she had not been mistaken when she chose to stay. But the knock never came, and the silence of the castle stretched on, deep and cold as winter. She did not know when sleep finally took her. One moment she was sitting on the cold stone floor with her arms wrapped around her knees, and the next she was somewhere between waking and dreaming, a gray place where the silence of the castle pressed against her ears like wool. She might have slept for an hour, or she might have slept for a bray. Time had lost its shape. When she opened her eyes, the room was still dark. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold had crept in through the gaps in the shutters. She was stiff, her neck aching from the awkward angle of her fall against the doorframe. For a long moment she simply sat there, letting the numbness of sleep wear off, waiting for the familiar weight of sadness to settle back onto her chest. But something was different. A faint, warm glow was seeping through the crack beneath her door. Not the flickering orange of torchlight, but a steady, golden warmth, the kind that came from a well-tended oil lamp. She stared at it for a long time, not quite trusting what she was seeing. She had blown out her candle hours ago. No one had any reason to be outside her door in the middle of the night. She rose slowly, her legs unsteady, and pressed the Piri palm flat against the wood. The warmth seeped through, faint but unmistakable. She lifted the latch with trembling fingers and pulled the door open just a crack. There, on the stone floor of the corridor, sat a small brass lamp. The glass was warm to the touch. Beside it, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, was a small clay bowl of porridge, still faintly steaming, and tucked beneath the bowl, so carefully folded it might have been a letter, was a heavy woolen blanket. The corridor was empty. Whoever had left these things was already gone. Claire knelt and touched the blanket. It was soft, well-worn, the kind of wool that had been washed 100 times until it lost its scratchiness. She lifted it to her face and breathed in the faint scent of wood smoke and something green, something like crushed pine needles. It smelled like the forest that surrounded the castle. It smelled like the north. She did not know why her eyes stung. She had not cried when her father called her worthless. She had not cried when Alexander had stayed silent. But now, kneeling in the cold corridor with a warm lamp at her feet and a stranger's blanket in her arms, she felt her throat tighten and her vision blur. She sat there for a long time, the lamp burning steadily beside her, and she did not go back inside. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat against the doorframe, watching the flame dance inside its glass chimney. She thought about the man who had placed it there, a man who could not see, who had no reason to know she had spent the night on the floor, who owed her nothing. And yet, she must have dozed off again, because when she next opened her eyes, the corridor was pale with the gray light of early morning. The lamp had burned low, its flame a small blue ghost at the edge. The porridge had cooled, but she ate it anyway, sitting on the floor in the half-dark, and it tasted like the first real food she had eaten in days. She did not know what to make of any of it. She only knew that when she finally stood and folded the blanket over her arm, she felt lighter than she had the night before. Not healed, nothing so simple, but lighter. Maren found her an hour later in the small garden behind the kitchens, sitting on a stone bench with the blanket still draped over her shoulders. The maid's eyes went wide when she saw it. "Is that—" Maren started, and then stopped herself. She looked at the blanket, then at Claire's face, then back at the blanket. "Ah, so you found it then." "Found what?" Claire asked, though she already knew. Maren sat down beside her, uninvited, and began fussing with the basket of herbs she had brought. "The king asked me where you slept last night. I told him you'd gone to your chambers early, and I didn't think nothing of it. But then he asked me again. Later. In that way he's listening to something I can't hear." She plucked a sprig of rosemary from the basket and turned it over in her fingers. "And then he said, 'The east corridor gets cold this time of year. Just that. Nothing else.'" Claire's fingers tightened on the blanket. "He knew I wasn't in my chambers." "Seems so," Maren said, and there was something almost approving in her voice. "He's like that, you know. Sees more than people expect. He doesn't miss much." Claire said nothing. She stared at the worn wool in her lap and thought about the steady golden light that had burned all night outside her door. Maren stood and brushed the dirt from her apron. "The king's in his study this morning, if you're wanting to thank him. He's had his brief—" "Think fast already, but he'll be there till noon, most likely." She paused at the gate and looked back over her shoulder. "He's never done that before, my lady. Not for anyone." She left before Claire could respond, and Claire sat alone in the garden with the blanket warming her shoulders and the question pressing against her heart like a stone. She went to the study. She did not plan the words. She did not know what she was going to say, but her feet carried her through the corridors, past the tapestries and the suits of armor, past the servants who bowed their heads as she passed, until she stood at the heavy oak door of the king's study. She raised her hand to knock, and then she hesitated. What was she doing? He was the alpha king of the Thornwood pack, a man whose word could send armies marching and whose silence could make grown men tremble. And she was the plain sister, the spare daughter, the one who had been sent away because she was easy to forget. What right did she have to knock on his door and demand an explanation for a kindness he had never promised her? But the blanket was still warm against her shoulders, and the lamp had burned all night, and she had spent the whole morning wondering if she had misjudged him. She knocked. "Come in," his voice came through the door, calm and unhurried. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth, and Alexander sat behind his desk with a book open in front of him. His fingers traced the page, hovering over the raised lines of the script, and he did not look up when she entered. He simply waited. "I found the lamp," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she had intended. "And the blanket. And the porridge." He closed the book and turned his face toward her, those great, the blue eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder. "The east corridor is cold this time of year," he said, echoing Marin's words. "I thought you might need them." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. She watched his face, looking for the telltale sign of evasion, the flicker of discomfort that would tell her he was only being polite, but his expression was as steady as the lamp flame had been. "Because you stayed," he said simply. "Your father gave you a choice, and you stayed." "I thought that deserved more than silence." Claire's breath caught. She had not expected him to speak of it. She had not expected him to acknowledge the night before at all. She had spent the morning convincing herself that the lamp was a gesture of pity, a way to soothe his own conscience without having to actually look at her. But this was something else. "You heard what he said to me," she whispered. "You heard him call me worthless." "I heard," Alexander said, "and I heard you refuse him. I heard you tell your own father that you would not spy on this household. I heard you choose loyalty over blood." He paused, and his voice dropped, soft and rough like the edge of a worn stone. "I heard you cry after he left." Claire felt her cheeks burn. She had been so certain no one had heard. She had been so certain the silence of the castle had swallowed her grief whole. "I did not cry," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. "No," Alexander said, and there was the ghost of something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you did not." He rose from his chair and crossed the room, his steps measured and sure, his hand brushing along the edge of the desk until he found the wall. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the faint gleam on the feathers at the corners of his eyes, the way his gaze never quite settled on her face. "I am not good at words," he said. "I have never been. People expect a king to speak boldly, to command with his voice, but I have always found that actions speak truer." He gestured vaguely toward the corridor where the lamp had stood. "That was my answer. I should have said it in the hall, in front of your father. I should have told you then that you are worth more than he will ever understand, but He stopped, and she saw his jaw tighten. "I am not used to being seen, not by anyone who matters." Claire stepped closer, and she did not know what she was doing until her hand closed around his. His fingers were warm and calloused, and she felt him startle at the touch, felt the tension run through his arm like a startled horse. "You gave me a lamp?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You gave me a blanket and a warm meal, and you did not ask for anything in return. Do you know what that means to someone who has spent her whole life being given things only when they were asked for?" He was very still. She could feel his pulse through his wrist, steady and strong. "It means you see me," she said. "Even without your eyes, you see me. And she swallowed. "I have never been seen before." His free hand lifted, hesitating in the air between them, and then it found her face. His fingers brushed her cheek, light as a breath, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He was mapping her, learning her the only way he could, and she stood very still and let him. "Your father said you were easy to forget," he murmured. "He was wrong. I could not forget you if I tried." She wanted to say something, but the words would not come. She stood there with his hand on her face and his words settling into her chest like warm stones, and she felt the tears she had held back the night before finally spill over. He felt them. His thumb brushed the wetness from her cheek, and he made a low sound, almost like a sigh. "Do not cry," he said. "I cannot see your tears, but I can hear them, and they are the only thing I wish I could not hear." She laughed, a wet, startled sound. "I thought you said you were not good with words." "I am not," he said, and the ghost of that sow returned. "I am making this up as I go along." She stepped back, wiping her face with her sleeve, and he let his hand fall. For a long moment they stood there in the warm, firelit room, and the silence between them was not cold. It was the kind of silence that held all the words they had not yet learned to say. "I should let you work," she said, though she did not want to leave. "Stay," he said. "If you have nothing else to do, I will not be able to see you, but I will know you are there, and that is enough." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, and he returned to his own seat, finding the book by memory. The fire crackled. The morning light grew stronger through the windows, and Claire sat in the quiet with the blanket still draped over her shoulders, watching the blind king read. And she thought that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been wrong about this place. Perhaps she had been wrong about a great many things. It was nearly noon when Sir Aldrich entered. He stopped short at the sight of Claire, and his hand went to the hilt of his sword out of habit, though he did not draw it. He looked at her, then at the king, and his brow furrowed. "My lord," he said, "I must speak with you, in private." Alexander set down his book. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my wife." Aldrich's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but Claire could still hear him clearly. "The matter concerns her, my lord. I have learned that she has been hiding a letter from her father. A letter that was not delivered to you." Claire's blood went cold. She had forgotten the letter. In the chaos of the night before, in the warmth of the lamp and the gentle pressure of Alexander's hand on her cheek, she had forgotten the damning piece of paper tucked into the lining of her trunk. But Alexander did not look surprised. He did not even look at her. He simply sat there, his hands folded on the desk, and said, "I know." Aldrich blinked. You know?" "I knew the day it arrived," Alexander said calmly. "A raven from the south flies differently than one from the north. I heard the change in its wings. I knew it carried your father's seal before it ever landed." Claire's heart was pounding. "You knew? All this time, and you did not say anything?" He turned his face toward her, and that unseeing gaze somehow found hers. "I was waiting to see what you would do with it," he said, "and you have shown me." Aldrich took a step back, his hand falling from his sword. He looked from the king to Claire, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. "My lord," he said, "I was wrong to doubt her." "You were right to doubt her," Alexander said. "Doubt is the price of vigilance, but you were wrong to keep your doubts from me." He reached into the drawer of his desk and withdrew a small object, which he held out across the desk toward Claire. "I want you to have this." She stepped forward and took it from his hand. It was cool and heavy, a signet ring of dark silver, stamped with the Thornwood sigil. The wolf's head would awe at the firelight as it turned in her palm. "This is," she looked up at him, "this is your seal, your family's mark. You cannot—" "I can," he said, "and I do. I am giving it to you not as a test, but as a trust. You chose me over your own blood. I would be a fool not to choose you back." Claire closed her fingers around the ring, and the cold silver warmed against her skin. She looked at the blind king across the desk, at the man who had heard her cry through stone walls, who had placed a lamp outside her door because he knew the east corridor was cold, who had seen her clearly when no one else had ever bothered to look. She did not know what the future held. She did not know if her father would return, or if the whispers of the court would ever truly die. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer the plain sister, the spare daughter, the one who was easy to forget. She was the wife of the Alpha King of Thornwood, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of what that meant. The news came on the third morning after the ring had settled on Claire's finger. Marin burst into the solar without knocking, her knitting abandoned in a heap by the door. "My lady, riders from the eastern border, 3 of them, and one's wounded." Claire was on her feet before she could think. The silver ring felt cold against her skin. "Where is the king?" "In the great hall. He's already been told. Sir Aldrich is with him." She did not run. A queen did not run, even a queen who had only worn the title for a handful of weeks. But she walked quickly, her skirts brushing the stone floor, and she did not stop to smooth her hair or adjust her shawl. Marin fell into step behind her, breathless. The great hall was colder than she remembered. Firelight flickered in the hearth, but the men standing around the long oak table cast long shadows that swallowed the warmth. Alexander sat at the head, his face unreadable, his hands resting flat on the wood. Sir Aldrich stood at his right, and beside him was a man Claire did not recognize, a rider still in his travel-stained cloak, his left arm bound in blood-soaked linen. "Raided at dawn," the rider was saying, his voice hoarse. "A dozen of them, maybe more. They came over the eastern ridge, burned the granary at Millbrook, and were gone before the patrol could form up. Names, Alexander said. His voice was low, flat, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that anger was a weapon best kept sheathed. The rider hesitated. My lord, the raiders flew no banner, but the men who survived, they said the leader wore a sigil they did not recognize, a black stag on a field of gray. A murmur rippled through the men at the table. Claire felt it more than heard it, the shift in posture, the quick exchange of glances. A black stag was not a Thornwood sigil. It was not a Whitmore sigil either, but it was a sigil she had seen before, embroidered on the sleeve of a man who had ridden south with her father, a man who always seemed to be watching, always seemed to be counting. Lord Percival. She did not speak, but Alexander turned his head just slightly in her direction, the way he did when he was listening for something beyond the words in the room. The silence stretched. Leave us, Alexander said finally. All of you. Aldrich, see that the rider is tended to. The hall emptied. Boots scraped against stone. The rider was helped out by 2 guards, and the heavy doors swung shut with a sound like a held breath. Claire stood where she was, near the threshold, her hands clasped with Deacon in front of her. Marin, she said quietly. Wait outside. The maid hesitated, then dipped her head and slipped through the doors. The great hall fell into a silence so complete that Claire could hear the embers shifting in the hearth. Alexander did not move. His hands still rested on the oak table, his face still turned toward the empty space where the rider had stood. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. You know the sigil? It was not a question. Claire felt her throat tighten. She could have lied. She could have said she did not recognize it, that she had never seen a black stag in her life. But the ring on her finger was warm now, and she had made her choice 3 nights ago, in this very hall, when she had closed her fingers around a piece of silver and said, with her whole heart, that she would stay. I know it, she said. It belongs to Lord Percival of House Mullen. He rode north with my father's party. And you did not think to mention this before now? The words were not sharp. That was what made them hurt. They were flat, measured, the words of a king who had been betrayed before and had learned not to be surprised by it. Claire took a step forward, then another. She did not stop until she stood at the head of the table, close enough to see the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands pressed just a little harder into the wood. I did not know he was a threat, she said. I thought he was merely a companion of my father's, a man who enjoyed the hunt and the company of powerful men. I did not know he had raised men against your borders. I did not know he wore his house sigil into battle. Alexander was silent for a long moment, then he said, But you knew he was watching. It was not a question. Claire's breath caught. He thought of Lord Percival's eyes in the great hall of Whitmore, grey and flat as winter slate, always sliding over her as if she were furniture. She thought of the way he had smiled at her father when the marriage contract was signed, the smile of a man who had just won a hand of cards he had not even been dealt. He watched everyone, she said quietly. I thought that was simply how he was, that he was a man who collected people the way other men collected coins. He collected your father as well, then? Claire blinked. I do not understand. Alexander's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, across the table. It came to rest near her own, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. 3 days ago I told you that I had known about your father's letters, he said. I did not tell you everything I know. Your father did not come north alone to check on the progress of your marriage. He came because Lord Percival convinced him that the Thornwood border was soft, that a wedge could be driven into the eastern passes, that the old alliance between our houses could be turned to a different purpose. Claire felt the floor shift beneath her. My father is a hard man, she said slowly, but he is not a traitor. He would not raise arms against a house his daughter had married into. He would not, Alexander agreed, but he is a man who believes he has already lost a daughter, and Percival is very good at making men believe that what they have lost is worth less than what they might gain by reaching for more. The words settled over Claire like a cold cloak. She thought of her father's voice, sharp and impatient, telling her that her only value was the marriage she could secure. She thought of the way he had looked at her on the day she left, not with sigh, not with regret, but with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who had already moved on to the next piece on the board. "He does not know I am gone," she said, almost to herself. "He does not know I have chosen to stay." "He knows," Alexander said. "He was informed the morning after you refused to send him the information he asked for. And he did not leave the border, Claire. He is still there, camped within a day's ride of the Eastern Pass, with Lord Percival beside him." The great hall was very quiet. Claire could hear her own heartbeat, slow and heavy like a drum in the distance. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "I am the daughter of the man who is camped at your border. I am the wife he sent to you because he believed I was worthless. Why would you trust me with this?" Alexander's hand moved again. This time it found hers. Warm, calloused, steady. He did not grip. He simply rested his palm against her knuckles, and she felt the ring on her finger press against his skin. "Because you chose me," he said. "Not because I am a king. Not because I hold land or title or power. You chose me when you did not have to. You chose me when your own blood was telling you to walk away. And I have been betrayed by men who smiled at me and called me friend. I will not be betrayed by a woman who cried in the dark because she was afraid she was not enough." Claire's eyes burned. She blinked, hard, and the tears did not fall. But they were there, waiting, patient as the tide. "What do you need me for do?" she asked. Alexander's thumb traced a slow circle against her knuckles. "I need you to be my eyes where mine cannot reach. Lord Percival will come to this castle. He will smile and he will bow. And he will pretend he is a loyal subject who has come to pay his respects
to the new queen. He will bring your father with him, because your father is the reason he has an excuse to be here. And you want me to see him?" "I want you to watch him," Alexander said. "Not with your eyes alone, but with the part of you that noticed the way his hands hung at his sides when he thought no one was looking. The part of you that saw the tension in his jaw before he smiled. You are not plain, Claire. You are observant. And that is a weapon no one ever thought to take from you." The ring on her finger felt heavier now, and stronger, as if it had absorbed the weight of his words. "Tomorrow," Alexander continued, "Lord Percival and your father will arrive at the gates. They will ask to speak with me. You will be present. You will be the one to greet them, because you are the queen of this house, and they cannot enter without your word." Claire's breath caught. "You want me to receive them?" "I want them to see you," Alexander said. "I want them to see the woman they sent away, wearing my ring, standing in my hall. And I want them to understand that they did not lose a plain sister. They lost a queen." He lifted his hand from hers, and for a moment the absence of his warmth was almost painful. Then he reached across the table, found a small bell, and rang it once. The doors opened and Sir Eldrick stepped inside. "Eldrick," Alexander said, his voice shifting back to the flat, measured tone of command. "Send riders to the Eastern Pass. I want eyes on the Whitmore camp. And prepare the guest quarters for Lord Percival and his party. They will be arriving tomorrow." Eldrick's gaze flickered to Claire, then back to Alexander. "My lord, you are certain it is wise to receive them within the castle walls?" "I am certain it is wise to know where your enemies are,"
Alexander replied. "And I am certain that the queen will be the one to greet them." Aldrich's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head. "As you command, my lord." He turned to leave, but Alexander spoke again, his voice just a little softer. "Aldrich, you doubted her once. You told me she might be a spy. You were wrong. Remember that when you look at her tomorrow." The knight's shoulders stiffened. For a long, uncomfortable moment he did not move. Then he turned, met Claire's eyes, and gave her a small, stiff bow. The bow of a man who was not yet ready to apologize, but was willing to admit he had been mistaken. "My lady," he said, "I will not forget." He left, and the doors swung shut behind him. Claire stood alone with Alexander in the great hall, the fire crackling in the hearth, the shadows long and patient. "Alexander," she said quietly, using his name for the first time without hesitation, "what I am not enough? What if they look at me and see the same plain sister they have always seen? He turned his face toward her, and even though his eyes could not see her, she felt the weight of his gaze like a hand on her shoulder. "Let them look," he said. "They will not be seeing what I see." That night, Claire could not sleep. She lay in the great bed, the wolf's head ring on her finger, and listened to the wind moving through the stones of the castle. Somewhere beyond the walls, her father was camped with a man who wore a black stag on his sleeve. Somewhere beyond the walls, a war was being measured in careful increments like a tailor measuring cloth for a shroud. She rose before dawn, dressed in her finest gown, and walked to the window of her chamber. The eastern road stretched out before her, pale in the gray morning light, and at the far end of it, just visible, as a smudge of movement against the tree line, she saw the banners of Whitmore approaching. But she also saw something else. A small figure on horseback, breaking away from the main party, riding hard toward the castle. A messenger, perhaps? Or a scout? She watched until the figure disappeared behind the outer wall. Then she touched the ring on her finger, and she waited. The doors to the great hall were opened to receive the guests at midday. Claire stood at the head of the stairs. Alexander's arm rested lightly on hers, his face calm and unreadable. The riders entered the courtyard below, and there, at the front, was her father, Lord Whitmore. His gray beard trimmed for the occasion, his eyes sharp and assessing. Beside him, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who had never known a day of hard labor, was Lord Percival. He looked up at her, and for a moment his gaze was flat and cold. The gaze of a man who was already counting the cost of a war he had not yet won. Then he smiled, and he bowed, and he said, "Your Grace, how wonderful to see you looking so well. Your family has missed you." Claire felt Alexander's hand tighten very slightly on her arm. She lifted her chin, and she met Lord Percival's eyes with a calm she did not feel. "My lord," she said, her voice steady, "you are welcome in the house of Thornwood. I trust your journey was uneventful." Percival's smile did not waver, but something flickered behind it. Something quick and sharp, like a blade catching the light. "Uneventful enough," he said, "though the roads are always dangerous this time of year. One never knows what may be lurking in the shadows." The words hung in the air between them, and Claire, who had spent her whole life being told she was not enough, felt the ring on her finger grow warm, and she did not look away. That night, long after the feast had ended, and the guests had retired, Claire stood at the window of her chamber and watched the courtyard below. The torches burned low, the guards made their rounds, and in the shadow of the eastern tower she saw two figures meet. One was Lord Percival, the other, taller, broader, moving with the heavy stride of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, was her father. They spoke for only a moment, heads bent close, voices too low to carry. Then they parted, each disappearing into the darkness, and the courtyard was empty again. Claire stood at the window for a long time, the wolf's head ring pressing against her palm. She did not know what they had said. She did not know what they were planning, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the crisis she had feared was no longer a distant rumor. It was here, in her home, wearing a smile, and she was the only one who had seen it. The morning came cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the stone walls of the keep feel heavier than they were. Claire had not slept. She had sat by the window through the dark hours, the wolf's head ring cold against her palm, and she had made her decision. She found Alexander in the great hall, standing alone by the hearth. He did not turn when she entered, but she knew he had heard her. The slight tilt of his head told her that much. "You are up early," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something waiting in it, like a held breath. "I need to tell you something," Claire said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Last night I saw Lord Percival. He met with my father in the courtyard, by the eastern tower. They spoke for only a moment, but they were careful not to be seen." Alexander thing was still for a long moment. Then he turned toward her, his gray-blue eyes unseeing but somehow fixed on her face. "You are certain it was them?" "I am certain." He did not ask why she had waited until morning to tell him. He did not ask why she had not come to him in the night. Instead, he said, quietly, "You chose to tell me." "Yes." Even though he is your father? Claire's throat tightened. He is my father by blood, but I know what he is doing here. She paused, and the next words came out softer, but no less certain. I know what he plans to ask of me. I know what he expects me to do. Alexander took a step toward her. And what will you do, Claire? She lifted her chin. I will not do it. I will not be his eyes in your house. The silence that followed was not cold. It was warm, almost, the silence of something settling into place. The summons came before midday. Lord Whitmore and Lord Percival requested an audience with the King of Thornwood, and Alexander granted it. Claire stood beside him in the great hall, dressed in the deep green gown that Marin had pressed the night before. She had wanted to look strong. She had wanted to look like she belonged in this hall, at his side, and she thought perhaps she did. Her father entered first. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the same brown hair Claire had inherited, and the same stubborn set to his jaw. He looked at her once, briefly, and then his gaze moved past her as if she were not there. Lord Percival followed. He was thinner than her father, with sharp features and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He bowed to Alexander with practiced grace. Your Majesty, Percival said, we are honored by your hospitality. I trust the border has been quiet since our arrival. Quiet enough, Alexander said. His voice was pleasant, but Claire could hear the edge beneath it. Though I understand there was some disturbance in the eastern reaches not long ago. Riders bearing a black stag? Percival's smile did not waver. A black stag? I have heard nothing of such raiders, but the border is vast, and rumors travel faster than truth. They do, Alexander agreed. That is why I prefer to trust what I can see. He said the words calmly, and Claire felt the weight of them. He could not see, not with his eyes. But he saw things other men missed, and she had learned that in the weeks since her arrival. Her father shifted his weight. Your Majesty, we came to speak of matters of alliance. Our houses are joined now. Through this marriage, there is much we could accomplish together. There is, Alexander said. But let us speak plainly. Lord Whitmore, you did not come here to discuss trade routes or treaties. You came to ask something of me. What is it? The hall fell silent. Claire could hear the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the distant sound of guards moving in the corridors. Her father's jaw tightened. I came to remind you of the terms of our agreement. The Whitmore lands lie vulnerable on their eastern border. We have long been beset by raiders from the hills. I had hoped that our alliance might include a promise of troops, should the need arise. Troops, Alexander repeated. You want my soldiers. Your soldiers? Yes. In exchange, I offer the full weight of our house's support in your dealings with the southern lords. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, And what of your daughter? What does she receive in this exchange? Her father blinked. My daughter? Your daughter, Claire, the woman you sent to marry me. What does she receive from you in this arrangement? The question seemed to unsettle Lord Whitmore. He glanced at Claire, then away. She is my daughter. She has been honored with a place at your side. That is more than she deserves? Alexander's voice was quiet, but it cut through the hall like a blade. That is what you were going to say, is it not? More than she deserves. Alexander's voice was quiet, but it cut through the hall like a blade. That is what you were going to say, is it not? Lord Whitmore's face reddened. I did not say that. You did not have to. You have said it with every letter you have sent her, every time you have reminded her of her purpose here. Alexander stepped forward, and though his eyes were unseeing, his presence filled the hall. You sent her to me because you believed she had no other value. You sent her because you thought I would not notice her worth, because you thought I, blind as I am, would not be able to see what you were hiding. Your Majesty, she has calluses on her fingers, Alexander said, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. Calluses from mending harnesses and tending gardens, from work that you never asked her to do but that she did anyway. Because she saw what needed to be done and did it without complaint. She hums an old song when she thinks no one is listening, a song I have not heard since I was a child, a song my mother used to sing. She leaves cups of warm tea outside my study door on nights when I cannot sleep, and she never stays to take credit for it. His voice softened. She noticed that the eastern tower windows do not lock properly, and she told Sir Aldrich before the autumn rains. She knows the names of every stable hand and every kitchen maid, and she remembers which of them has a sick mother or a newborn child. She is not a chess piece, Lord Whitmore.
She is not a bargaining tool. She is the most observant, the most steadfast, the most quietly courageous woman
I have ever known. Claire felt tears burning behind her eyes. She had not known he knew. The tea, the calyces, the song, she had thought those moments were hers alone, private and unseen. "Alexander," she whispered, but he was not finished. "You called her plain," he said, turning back to her father. "You called her useless. You sent her here as a cast-off, a piece of refuse you no longer had any use for. And in doing so, you gave me the only person in this kingdom who has ever looked at me and seen a man, not a title." He took a breath. "She is not your discarded daughter. She is my chosen wife, and you will not speak of her as anything less in my hall again." The silence that followed was absolute. Claire's father stared at Alexander, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Lord Percival had gone very still, his sharp eyes flickering between the king and his host. Then Percival laughed. It was a thin, brittle sound. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but this is sentiment. A pretty speech for a wife who was not chosen but assigned. Surely you do not mean to let a marriage of convenience dictate your foreign policy." "Lord Percival," Alexander said, his voice cold, "you misunderstand me. I am not letting anything dictate my foreign policy. I am telling you that your proposal is refused." "Refused?" Lord Wheatmore's voice rose. "You cannot refuse. We have an agreement. The marriage is sealed." "The marriage is sealed, yes, but the alliance was conditional on the treatment of my wife. And I have seen how you treat her." Alexander's hand found Claire's, his fingers closing around hers with quiet certainty. "The troops will not be sent. The southern lords will not be moved. And if I hear that any riders bearing a black stag have crossed into my lands bad, I will take it as an act of war." Percival's smile vanished. "Your Majesty, I assure you, I have no knowledge of any riders." "I know," Alexander said softly. "I know you are lying. I have known since the day you arrived. I lost my sight in a battle, Lord Percival. Do you know who betrayed me on that field?" Percival went pale. "A man who wore your colors," Alexander continued. "A man who I had trusted, who I had called friend. He led me into an ambush, and I paid for his treachery with my eyes. I have spent years wondering why he did it. And now, seeing how you move through my hall, how you smile and bow and scheme, I think I understand. You are the same kind of man. You smile while you sharpen your knife." The words hung in the air like smoke. Claire felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had not known. He had never told her the story of his blindness. And now she understood why. Lord Whitmore stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is an outrage. I came here in good faith." "You came here to use me," Alexander said. "And you came here to use her. But she is no longer yours to use." He turned to Claire, and though he could not see her, his voice softened. "Claire, do you have anything you wish to say to your father?" Claire stood very still. The wolf's head ring was warm against her palm. She thought of all the years she had spent being invisible, being overlooked, being told she was not enough. She thought of the letters her father had sent, the orders to spy, the expectation that she would trade her husband's trust for her family's favor. She thought of Alexander, who had seen her when no one else had. She stepped forward. "Father," she said, and her voice was steady, "I have spent my whole life trying to earn your approval. I have quiet when I wanted to speak.
I have made myself small so that you would not notice me, and when I was no longer useful to you in your own hall, you sent me here. Not because you believed I could be happy, but because you believed I could be a tool." Lord Whitmore's face twisted. "Claire, you do not understand." "I understand more than you think," she said. "I saw you last night, in the courtyard, with Lord Percival. I saw you planning, and I knew then that you had not given up on using me." Her father's eyes widened. "You? You know nothing." "I know that I am done being your tool," Claire said. "I know that I am done being invisible, and I know that I am done trying to earn a love that you were never willing to give." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Alexander sees me. He sees me, father, and that is more than you have ever done." The hall was silent. Lord Whitmore's face had gone from red to pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Percival stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a mistake, Your Majesty. You are choosing a woman over an alliance. You are choosing sentiment over strategy." "No," Alexander said. "I am choosing her over you. And I would make that choice 1,000 times over." The audience ended shortly after. Lord Whitmore and Lord Percival were escorted to their chambers. Under guard, Claire did not watch them go. She stood beside Alexander in the great hall, her hand still in his, and she did not let go. When the doors closed behind them, Alexander turned to her. "Are you all right?" Claire laughed, a sound that was half shock, half tears. "I do not know. I think I am. I think I have never been more terrified in my life." "You were brave," he said. "You were braver than anyone I have ever known."
"Fast on my spell. I was not brave," she said. I was tired. Tired of being small, tired of being unseen." She looked at him, at his unseeing eyes, and felt a wave of love so strong it almost took her breath away. "You saw me, Alexander. You saw me when no one else did. How could I not choose you?" He reached up, his fingers finding her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I have been blind for years, Claire, but I have never seen anyone the way I see you." She leaned into his touch, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I thought I would never belong anywhere. I thought I was not worth belonging to." "You were wrong," he said softly. "You were always worth it. It was the rest of the world that could not see it." That night Claire walked to the garden alone. The air was cold, the sky clear, and the stars scattered across the darkness like seeds. She found the bench where she often sat in the mornings, and she sat down, and she began to hum. The song came to her easily, the old melody that had lived in her memory since childhood. She did not know where she had learned it. She only knew it felt like home. She was halfway through the verse when she heard footsteps on the path. She looked up, and Alexander was there, his hand resting on the low stone wall. "Do not stop," he said. "Please." She continued humming, and he walked toward her, finding the bench by memory and sitting down beside her. The space between them was small, and it felt sacred. "Claire," he said when she had finished, "that song. My mother used to sing it. I have not heard it in 20 years. She felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. "I do not know where I learned it. I have always known it. It was like it was waiting for me." Alexander smiled. It was a rare smile, soft and unregarded, and it made him look younger. Perhaps it was. Perhaps some things are meant to find their way home. He turned toward her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I meant what I said today, Claire. Every word. You are my chosen wife. You are my home now, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Claire squeezed his hand. "I know it," she said. "I believe you." She looked up at the stars, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel like she was waiting for something to change. She was not waiting to be seen. She was not waiting to be worth something. She was home. The morning came cool and gray, with a thin mist clinging to the walls of the keep. Claire woke to the sound of urgent footsteps in the corridor, not the slow, measured tread of servants going about their duties, but the quick, sharp rhythm of men in a hurry. She was already dressed when the knock came. It was Marin, her face pale. "My lady, the boarder. Sir Aldrich has sent word. There has been an attack." Claire's heart tightened. She reached for the small leather pouch she kept at her belt, the one that held the silver ring Alexander had given her. She had not taken it off since that night, even to sleep. It was a small thing, cool and heavy in her palm, but it felt like a promise made solid. She found Alexander in the great hall, standing before a map spread across the long oak table. Sir Aldrich stood beside him, his voice low and tense. The fire had not yet been lit, and the hall was cold with the breath of early autumn. "They came at dawn," Sir Aldrich was saying. "A small party, no more than a dozen men. They burned the watchtower at the eastern pass and withdrew before our riders could engage." "They were testing us," Alexander said quietly. His hand moved across the thing with unnerving precision, his fingers finding the eastern pass as if he could see the ink beneath them. "This is not an invasion. This is a question. What question? Claire asked. Alexander turned toward her voice. Whether we are still watching, whether my blindness has made us careless. He paused. It is Percival's way. He does not strike with force. He strikes with doubt. Claire moved to stand beside him. She had learned in the weeks since her arrival not to flinch at the way his attention settled on her without his eyes meeting hers. He saw her. She had stopped doubting that. She only wondered, sometimes, what exactly he saw. "Can we answer his question?" she asked. A faint smile touched his mouth. "I believe we can." Sir Aldrich cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if I may, the Eastern Pass is our weakest point. If Percival has learned its layout, and if he has allies within the southern houses—" "He does not have allies within my house," Claire said. She did not raise her voice, but something in her tone made Sir Aldrich pause. "My father is confined to his chambers. Whatever letters Percival believes he has sent, they will not be answered." The knight looked at her for a long moment, then he inclined his head. "As you say, my lady." Alexander's hand found hers beneath the edge of the table. His grip was warm, steady. "There is a path," he said, "that leads from the keep to the Eastern Pass. It is old, unused. The elders say it was cut by the first lords of Thornwood, for escape in times of siege. I have not walked it since I was a boy." "Before you lost your sight," Claire said softly. "Yes, but I remember it. Every stone, every turn." He turned toward her, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not helplessness, but a quiet, fierce determination. "If Percival is watching the main roads, he will not expect us to come from the mountain. We can meet his riders before they reach the pass." Sir Aldrich stepped forward. "Your Majesty, with respect. The path is dangerous if you were to fall." "I will not fall," Alexander said. "And I will not send my men where I am not willing to go myself." Claire looked at the map, at the thin line that marked the Eastern Pass, and then at the man beside her. She had seen him command a room without raising his voice. She had seen him stand unshaken before her father's cruelty. She had seen him place his own ring in her hand and trust her with it. She did not doubt him now. "I will go with you," she said. Alexander's brow furrowed. "Claire." "I know the pass," she said. "I studied it the first week I arrived, from the old maps in the library. I know where the watchtower stood, and I know the gorge below it." She paused. "And I have your ring. If we are separated, I can summon the keep's guards. You gave it to me for a reason." The silence stretched. Sir Aldrich looked from Claire to Alexander, his jaw tight, as if he wanted to object but could not find the words. Then Alexander smiled. It was the same rare, unguarded smile she had seen in the garden the night before, and it made her chest ache with something she could not name. "Then we go, together," he said. The mountain path was narrow and steep, cut into the rock by hands long since turned to dust. Claire walked just behind Alexander, close enough to reach him if he stumbled, though he did not stumble. His steps were sure, his hand trailing along the rock wall as if he were reading the stone with his fingertips. They moved in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the distant cry of a hawk. Claire packed her hand on the pouch at her belt, feeling the cool weight of the ring against her palm. They reached the Eastern Pass as the sun climbed past the ridge. Below them she could see the burned remains of the watchtower, blackened timbers still smoking in the morning air. And beyond it, moving through the trees, a small company of riders, their banners bearing the black stag of Percival's house. Alexander stopped. He did not need to see to know they were there. He had felt it, she realized. The change in the air, the subtle shift of sound. His head turned slightly, listening. "How many?" he asked. 12, she said. "Maybe 14. They are moving slowly, as if they expect no resistance." "Good." He reached for her hand, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the old scars from battles she would never see. "Do you remember what I told you, Claire? That you are more than they believed?" "Yes. I meant it then. I mean it now." He squeezed her hand. "When I give the signal, you take the ring and you go to the keep. You do not wait for me. Do you understand?" She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him she would not leave him. But she saw the set of his jaw, the quiet certainty in his face, and she knew that this was not a request. "I understand," she said. He smiled again, that soft smile that made her heart turn over. "Then trust me, my love." She did. The signal came moments later, a low whistle, barely audible over the wind. From the trees on the far side of the pass, Sir Aldrich's riders emerged, moving to cut off the enemy's retreat. And Alexander moved forward, not with the hesitant steps of a blind man, but with the sure, swift stride of a lord who had walked these lands since childhood. Claire watched him for one breath, two, and then she turned and ran. Ring was in her hand, cold and solid. She did not look back. She reached the keep as the first sounds of combat echoed from the pass. She did not stop to catch her breath. She went straight to the captain of the guard, held out the ring, and spoke in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. "The Alpha King's orders. Send half your men to the eastern pass. The other half hold the walls. No one enters or leaves without my leave." The captain looked at the ring, then at her face. He did not hesitate. "Yes, my lady." She stood at the gate as the riders departed, her heart pounding in her throat. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She tried not to imagine the worst. She tried to remember the way he had smiled at her in the garden, the way he had said her name like it was something precious. She did not know how long she waited. But when she saw him riding back through the pass, Sir Aldrich at his side, and the black stag banners dragging in the dust behind them, she felt something break loose inside her chest, a tightness she had not known she was holding. She ran to meet him. He dismounted before she reached him, as if he knew she was coming. His hands found her shoulders, steadying her as she nearly collided with him. "Are you hurt?" she demanded. "Tell me you are not hurt." "I am not hurt," he said. His voice was rough, tired, but there was warmth in it. "They were testing us, just as I said. They scattered when they saw Aldrich's riders. It was not a fight, it was a message." "What message?" He was quiet for a moment. "That Percival knows he cannot take this land by force, not while we stand together." His hand moved to her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You did well today, Claire. The captain told me. You held the keep." "I was afraid," she admit. "Ethan is past hay." "So was I." He said it simply without shame. "But I knew you would do what needed to be done. I trusted you." She closed her eyes, letting herself lean into his hand. "I do not know what I would have done if—" "Shh." He drew her close, his arms wrapping around her. "I am here. We are both here. That is what matters." The afternoon passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet relief. Sir Aldrich reported that the eastern pass had been secured. The watchtower would be rebuilt before winter, and no further signs of Percival's forces had been seen. The black stag banners were burned in the courtyard, and the smoke rose gray against the pale autumn sky. Claire did not see her father. She did not ask where he was. She had made her choice in the great hall, and she did not regret it. Whatever he had meant to her once, he had made it clear. She was not his daughter. She was his tool. She was something else now. That evening she found Alexander in the garden, sitting on the stone bench where they had spoken the night before. The stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the deepening blue. He turned his head as she approached, and she wondered, not for the first time, how he always knew. "The song," she said, sitting beside him. "The one I sing. You asked who taught me." He nodded slowly. "I have wondered." She looked down at her hands, at the silver ring on her finger. "I did not remember, at first. But today when I was running back to the keep, I remembered something. My mother used to hum it when I was very small, before she died. She told me it was a song her dearest friend had taught her when they were young." Alexander was very still. "Her friend?" "I did not know her name. My mother never spoke of her after they parted." Claire paused. "But the way you met—"
Think, he needs the song, the way it was your mother's. I think they must have been the same person. I think our mothers knew each other, Alexander, long before we were born." The silence stretched between them. She could not read his face in the darkness, but she felt his hand find hers, his fingers curling around her own. "My mother used to say," he said softly, "that the best things in life are the ones you do not plan, the ones that find their way to you." He turned his head toward her. "I did not plan you, Claire. I did not plan to love you, but I am grateful that you found your way here." She felt tears prick her eyes. "I am grateful too," she whispered. "I was so afraid. At first I thought I was being discarded. I thought no one would ever see me." "I see you," he said. "I have seen you from the beginning, not with my eyes, with everything else, with every part of me that matters." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close against his side. The stars brightened overhead, one by one, and the garden was quiet save for the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. "Will you sing it for me?" he asked. "The song. I have not heard it in 20 years, but I remember it. I remember her." Claire smiled. She began to hum, softly at first, then to sing. The melody rose and fell, old and familiar, as if it had been waiting all this time to be heard again. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "That song was my mother's gift to yours, and now you have brought it back to me." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Some things, Claire, are meant to find their home." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face. In the starlight he looked younger, softer, as if a weight he had carried for years had
finally been set down. "Alexander," she said, "I want you to know, I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because I want to be here, because this is my home now." He smiled. "I know." "I love you," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud, and the words felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. His breath caught. Then his arms tightened around her, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I love you too, Claire, more than I know how to say." They sat together in the garden as the night deepened, the stars wheeling overhead. The song was silent now, but it lingered in the air between them, a thread joining two families, two pasts, two lonely hearts that had found each other at last. After a long while she spoke again. "Will you ask me to sing it again? Tomorrow?" "Yes," he said. "And the day after that? And every day after that, if you will have me?" She laughed, a soft, happy sound. "Then I will." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That song, Claire, it is yours now. Keep it safe." "I will. And sing it only to me," he added, his voice warm with something like teasing. "The way you sang it tonight. Only to me." She turned her head, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Only to you," she promised. And beneath the stars of Thornwood, in the garden where two strangers had once learned to see each other, they sat together until the moon rose high, and the night wrapped around them like a blessing. She was home. She had finally, truly, come home. She arrived at Thornwood as a pawn, but she stayed as a queen. Alexander may have lost his sight, but he was the only one who truly saw her heart. What would you have done in Claire's shoes? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. If their journey touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and join us for more incredible stories.